64 to Queen City, Boomer Von Kennen, WBT.
Hot. It's 5:05, and welcome into a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Hopefully you had a nice weekend and a good Monday morning to you. Well, our show continues this week tracking devastation in western North Carolina and the national attention that has been put on the tragedy unfolding in the mountains. Vice President Kamala Harris was in North Carolina this weekend to meet with recovery and relief officials. She also saw those volunteering and to show support, according to the White House, of victims of Hurricane Helene, which caused widespread devastation here in North Carolina. As of this morning, the storm is responsible for over 200 deaths in the United States and has become, in fact, a political issue in the presidential race, with the Republican Donald Trump and others criticizing disaster response, while Harris, the Democrat nominee, highlighted the Biden administration's efforts, including $100 million in federal aid to rebuild infrastructure like Interstate 40 and covering a damage and disaster cleanup for the next 6 months. Economic damage from this storm is now projected to reach over $250 billion, making it one of the most costly storms in U.S. history. Turning our attention to the state this morning, in the North Carolina General Assembly, well, they plan to vote on disaster relief legislation for areas of the state that were impacted by Helene this week. That's according to an announcement from legislative leaders on Friday. The legislature was already scheduled to be back in Raleigh on Wednesday with the potential veto override of House Bill 10. That piece of legislation covered the expansion of the Opportunity Scholarship Program, as well as other pieces of law that would have required sheriffs to work with ICE. But now both chambers, both the House and the Senate, are working to develop a plan to assist Western North Carolina communities that are still in desperate need of aid as a result of historic flooding. In a joint press release, Speaker of the House Tim Moore and Senate Leader Phil Berger said they have heard directly from residents in North Carolina and saw the devastation firsthand. In a joint press release, they said both, quote, "Over the past week, we've heard directly from residents in Western North Carolina and have seen the devastation. Our hearts are broken for the communities that have been ravaged by Hurricane Helene. Despite the destruction, it has been incredible to see how North Carolinians have stepped up to help. We cannot let up on those efforts or forget about the small communities that have been effectively closed off because of this storm. The General Assembly is preparing to come back next week, that's this week, to vote on an initial disaster relief package to facilitate the state's response to Hurricane Helene. We are still working to determine what needs to be included in that legislation. Our thoughts and prayers remain with the victims of the storm and those who have lost loved ones, as well as those aid workers, volunteers, and rescue teams that are supporting in the region." Helene is now responsible for 115 deaths in North Carolina. As I mentioned, nationally, that number is over 227 as of right now. President Joe Biden responded on Sunday to North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper's request for additional support by ordering the deployment of an additional 500 active duty troops to Western North Carolina. This brings the total to 1,500. That's including the also 6,000 plus National Guardsmen that are on the ground and more than 7,000 federal personnel from various departments, as the effort to provide relief and get that relief into Western North Carolina does continue. Power outages do improve. That's a positive note this morning. However, there are still more than 132,000 customers without power. When we were last with you together on Friday morning, morning, that number was over 207,000. So an improvement there, but still a lot of work to be done. We'll have a quote from an interesting audio clip from Duke Energy coming up a little bit later on in the program. The North Carolina State Board of Elections has a scheduled press availability at 2 o'clock today. They will be discussing continued recovery efforts in the western half of the state and the impact it might have as voting. As we sit here less than 30 days ahead of Election Day, early voting starts next Thursday. We'll see if that's going to be the case out in western North Carolina. The chairman of the House Homeland Security Subcommittee is now asking the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to detail what they did to prepare for Hurricane Helene after it became clear that there would be catastrophic flooding. It's hard to believe, but Helene made landfall back on September the 26th. Yet here we are talking about it on October the 7th. That made landfall in the Big Bend region of Florida, causing flooding and devastation in states like North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, and of course Florida. In a letter sent on Saturday, Representative Anthony D'Esposito, who is the chairman of the House Emergency Management and Technology Subcommittee, asked the FEMA administrator, quote, for information regarding FEMA's advanced forecasting models, its pre-positioning of resources, and its coordination with federal, state, and local partners in response. A spokesperson for FEMA did confirm that the agency did receive the letter and will work with Congress on Hurricane Helene efforts to discuss those various questions. D'Esposito cited local officials from Buncombe County who claimed that the water was requested before the storm but was delayed. That further exacerbated water shortages in the Asheville area. That is referring to this clip that we played for you last week.
The message that we would say is that we've been asking for water and we just getting water and it's still in low quantities. There's a large need in our community and we would like to see a different response from our state partners. A better response from our state partners. That will be the message from the staff's perspective. And this afternoon, we would have our elected officials with us. And I have not asked them what their response would be, but from a staff's perspective, our response would be clearly, we've been asking, we've been requesting, we've been following protocol since the storm began. And to this morning at 2:30 a.m. was the first delivery of water to our community.
That was the Buncombe County manager. That clip is from 1 week ago, and that 2:30 a.m. water delivery would have been a little over 7 days ago. That was last Monday when that first batch of water made it into the area. The criticism of FEMA, the criticism of the response continues this morning as elected officials and citizens from portions of western North Carolina question and what they deem to be the delayed response. I'm sure that's not the end of that story and the criticism there. We'll continue to track those details over at carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:12 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Time for a look at your early morning commute with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good.
Pete Kaliner. Today, noon to 3. WBT.
Your emergency situation station.
Hot. 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Good Monday morning to you. The North Carolina General Assembly was already slated to be back in Raleigh this week. They were looking at doing a veto override of House Bill 10. That would have expanded the Opportunity Scholarship Program in North Carolina, as well as required sheriffs in all 100 counties to cooperate with ICE. However, they are planning to be back this week and also tackling disaster relief for areas in the western half of the state that were ravaged by Hurricane Helene. Legislative leaders announced on Friday that they were already scheduled to be back. Now, both chambers say that they are working to develop a plan to assist Western North Carolina communities that are in desperate need of aid from that historic flooding. Over the past 6 years, the state has strengthened its financial preparedness for disasters. The State Emergency Response / Disaster Relief Reserve has increased to $733 million, while the Savings Reserve, that's just like their general savings account, has $4.75 billion in it. For comparison, when Hurricane Florence ravaged portions of southeastern North Carolina back in 2018, those reserves were slightly lower, with only $104 million in the Disaster Relief Reserve and a little over $2 billion in the Savings Reserve. Reacting to communities that have seen effects over the past couple of weeks, they said that it's been incredible to watch North Carolinians step up. They urged people not to let up on efforts or forget about the small communities that have been impacted. Senator Michael Lee, the Republican from New Hanover County, said in a press release next week, referring to this week, we will return to Raleigh to take further steps as legislators, providing additional funding and enacting policy measures to fully support ongoing recovery efforts. While the legislature does not run the recovery operations, we can certainly fuel them, ensuring they will move as swiftly as humanly possible. The General Assembly is slated to gavel in on Wednesday. We'll be tracking those details over at carolinajournal.com. FEMA recently announced that Helene's relief efforts are expected to drain all of their reserves for the rest of the hurricane season. That must have folks in Florida this morning with a raised eyebrow, as they are expecting impacts on the East Coast from a major hurricane a little bit later on this week. FEMA is also in the crosshair this morning as they allocated over $650 million under the Shelter and Service Program to provide humanitarian services to non-citizen migrants following their release from the Department of Homeland Security. FEMA predicts that the agency will not have enough funds to make it through the hurricane season, which ends November the 30th. There's going to be a lot of discussion federally on that, and we'll be tracking those details here as well. It's now 5:23 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Local governments around Mecklenburg County appear to be expressing some support for some county tax increases. Joining us on the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning is Zach Rounsville. Zach, appreciate the time. You've been tracking this over at carolinajournal.com. What's the details?
Sure, Nick. We received a tip from a gentleman named Eric Roll, who's a resident of Huntersville. He's a former candidate for Huntersville Town Commissioner. He alerted us to a social media post that was put out on September 23rd regarding the town of Cornelius, talking about support for the sales tax increase that was recently passed by the Mecklenburg County Board of Commissioners and the City Council. It's a 1 cent sales tax increase, which is going to be used to fund the Red Line train that has been in the works since 1998 in the county, which is basically a commuter rail connecting residents from the northern part of Mecklenburg County and a little bit of Iredell down to Uptown. The project's been in the works for a long time, and voters have been expressing different opinions about whether they wanted to oppose or support the referendum, and it had finally gotten passed. But Mr. Roll tipped us off to this post from the town of Cornelius saying that they may have violated state law with their conduct in the posting. And the posting had said back on the 23rd that they were advocating for the development of landmark draft legislation that will bring substantial road funding to Cornelius and deliver the Red Line. Mr. Roll took issue with this, thinking that it was violating a state statute which says, among other things, a municipality shall not use public funds to endorse or oppose a referendum, election, or a particular candidate for elected office. Now, he did say that the referendum hasn't been passed yet. Obviously, it'll have to get approved by the General Assembly, but it was just an interesting turn of events that the certain municipalities had been advocating for this over some time. I had also talked to several of the stakeholders, Dr. Art McCullough, who's a resident of Mecklenburg County and a candidate for County Commission in District 5. He had expressed support for the sales tax increase, saying that it would be good for the county in terms of mass transportation and giving residents quick access, in dealing with traffic. They'll have the easier access to move around throughout the county. Some others are more skeptical. I also talked to Tariq Bokhari, who voted no on the referendum proposal. He is kind of mum right now on the issue regarding whether it's going to get passed by the General Assembly. He talked about the funding a little bit with me as well, and he says that funding is going to be an important consideration to make. He doesn't really have a timeline. It says it's supposed to fund $20 billion over a 30-year period, so I don't know exactly how that's going to shake out, but those are just some of the numbers that he had talked to me and discussed with me. But overall, this is what we're looking at. I don't know whether it actually violates state law. That's an open question. Obviously, the referendum hasn't been passed yet, but it's an interesting turn of events, and we'll see how it goes. There's a lot of different interaction out there. The town councils that I also spoke with, town managers in Davidson and Matthews, they've been non-committal in commenting, and they have no comment on whether the referendum social media post of support from Cornelius actually violates that state statute. So they're kind of hush-hush on the issue as well. They've both expressed support for the advancement of the draft legislation, because I'm assuming that they're going to, like what the benefits are of it in terms of revenue and transportation, and how efficient transportation will be in their various municipalities. But that's the story right now in terms of, I don't know how it's going to shake out, but the referendum will likely appear on the ballot in 2025, so we've got a bit of time as the story develops. I don't know if there'll be any developments moving forward, but we'll keep an eye on it.
Zach, for the purpose of our audience this morning, when we talk about this social media post from the town of Cornelius, it seems like it would be fair to equate it to if they came out and expressed support for a specific candidate that was on the ballot, a current town council member or somebody like that was running for re-election and expressed their support. Is that kind of what's in question and what we're talking about?
I think Mr. Roll was more concerned with the actual conduct of the language of the post itself. Mr. Roll told me that he's an attorney by profession, so he looks for those types of things when analyzing this. He doesn't like the Red Line community project proposal and the tax implications behind it. So I think that he was just drawing attention, from what I gathered, to the conduct of the post, because certain town councils have been doing this and town municipalities have been doing this for some time. He thinks they're all on board with it and they're working to support it in various ways, even though it's not on the ballot yet. And again, that remains an open question, but I think he was not tailoring it to any specific candidate. More so, he was tailoring it to drawing attention to the conduct of Cornelius and showing support for the referendum, which, if you read the language of the statute, one can make a case that it would violate it, but again, there's no referendum in place that would necessarily violate the statute, so that's up for interpretation.
Zach, just for a quick timeline on this, and you went through a couple of things already, why does this have to go to the General Assembly? Why can't Mecklenburg County themselves pass this and move forward? Why does this have to go up to the state?
Sure, it'll have to go up to the state in order for it to appear on the ballot. It'll have to go through the caucuses and go through the legislative process in order for it to appear on the countywide ballot for the NC General Assembly.
Zach Rounsville is our guest this morning. You can read more on his story by visiting CarolinaJournal.com. It's now 5:29 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Time for a look at your Monday commute. Boomer Von Cannon's got the latest in traffic.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
Oktoberfest News and Brews.
Wednesday, October 30th.
Presented by Kraft Body Scan.
Go to WBT.com for details. Cheers.
It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. We continue to track devastation in western North Carolina surrounding Hurricane Helene. Vice President Kamala Harris was in the state over the weekend where she met with relief officials and volunteers, all of those that supporting and victims of Hurricane Helene, which, as you are well aware at this point, caused widespread devastation in the western half of the state. As of this morning, Helene is responsible for 115 deaths in North Carolina. Nationally, 227 people have died as an impact from this storm. And, well, the relief efforts do continue this morning. The storm is projected to reach $250 billion worth of economic damage, making it one of the most costly storms to affect the United States in the history of dealing with hurricane relief and natural disasters. Turning our attention stateside, the North Carolina General Assembly plans to vote on disaster relief legislation for areas in the state that were impacted by Helene. They will be back in Raleigh this week. The legislature was already set to convene on Wednesday to deal with a potential veto override of House Bill 10. However, now both chambers say that they are working to develop a plan to assist western North Carolina communities that are in desperate need of aid as a result of historic flooding. In a joint press release, Speaker of the House Tim Moore and the Senate Leader Phil Berger said they have heard directly from residents in North Carolina and have seen the devastation firsthand. President Joe Biden on Sunday responded to a request from North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper for additional boots on the ground, and Joe Biden ordered the deployment of another 500 active duty troops to western North Carolina. This brings that total to 1,500. That includes more than 6,000 National Guardmen that do continue in the area and more than 7,000 federal personnel that are in the state as well. Power outages, getting an update on that. They do continue to improve, albeit slow, but work is still being done. 132,000 customers are without power this morning. That number was over 207,000 when we were last together on Friday morning. I caught an interesting clip on X. This is Dustin Richardson. He's been doing line work for Duke Energy for well over a decade. He's originally based out of the Raleigh area. He talked about the devastation and the destruction that he saw in the area over the weekend.
So why do we do this work? I think each and every individual here understands our purpose. It is better to give than receive. And in times of devastation and tragedy, although we're away from home and away from our families, the sense of being a help to others. Seeing pictures and hearing the devastation, but being able to see it firsthand and experience it has been something that we'll remember for a lifetime. Being able to put a smile on the people's faces, share with a listening ear, a caring heart. So why do we?
That's Dustin Richardson, who is a lineman for Duke Energy, talking about what he has seen firsthand as those restoration efforts do continue this morning. Obviously, getting infrastructure back online is one of the first big steps in recovering to some semblance of normalcy out in western North Carolina. As criticism continues to fly against FEMA, the state, in regards to the response, FEMA says they are out of money for the remainder of the hurricane season. This is going to be interesting to follow as Hurricane Milton is expected to make landfall as a major hurricane in parts of Florida's East Coast later this week. House Speaker Mike Johnson, who was on Fox News Sunday this weekend, said that Hurricane Helene's devastation does not require immediate action by Congress, however, to boost the federal disaster relief fund because it will take time to assess the damage and release the funds. Johnson didn't explicitly address Joe Biden's request last week for lawmakers to speed up the authorization of about $1.6 billion for the Small Business Administration to help rebuild from Hurricane Helene as Florida faces another potential hit. Johnson said this, quote, "It takes a while to calculate the actual damages, and the states are going to need some time to do that. You send specific needs and requests based on the actual damage that takes some time, especially with storms of this magnitude, and so Congress will do its job," indicating that not until there's dollar figures and amounts behind it, Congress isn't going to do anything. Lawmakers are due to return to session up in Washington, D.C. on November the 12th, a week after Election Day, depending on what impacts we look at from this Hurricane Milton that is going to be making its way into portions of Florida later this week. I guess depending on that and the current needs from FEMA, we'll see if that timeline is escalated due to the continued impacts over there. Helene, as I mentioned, is responsible for 115 deaths in North Carolina. Over 227 people have died across the United States. A recent social media post by the town of Cornelius has sparked controversy in Mecklenburg County, as some believe that the post shows support for a proposed 1-cent county sales tax increase, which would be illegal under state law prohibiting public funds from endorsing referendums. The proposed tax increase is expected to generate in the ballpark of $345 million in its first year and would fund the long-discussed Red Line commuter project, which would extend Charlotte's transit system. The Mecklenburg County Commissioners voted 6-3 to move forward with the referendum earlier this year, and Charlotte City Council approved it as well. However, this still does need approval from the North Carolina General Assembly before it was said to appear on the 2025 ballot. That would be in the municipal elections coming up next year. That's a story that we continue to track this morning over at carolinajournal.com. 543 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Getting reports of some fog in the area this morning. Boomer Von Cannon's got the latest on traffic.
You got to thank you, Nick. Yes, sir.
Brett Winterbull Show.
This afternoon at 3.
News Talk 1110 and 99.3.
WBT.
It's 5:50. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. As we sit here this morning, 29 days ahead of Election Day, what's going to happen in North Carolina? Well, the Carolina Journal poll will be released next week, and you've got an opportunity to get that presentation in and around the Charlotte area. Join Carolina Journal's Donna King and the John Locke Foundation's Mitch Kokai to discuss the results of the October Carolina Journal poll. You are expected to join and invited to join at the Jesse Helms Center. That's in Wingate, North Carolina. Coming up on Thursday, October the 17th. The event runs from 5:30 until 7 p.m. You can find out more details and get your tickets now by visiting johnlocke.org. That's johnlocke.org. 5:50 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Kamala Harris was in the state over the weekend as she toured portions of western North Carolina, meeting with officials and, surveying the damage caused by Hurricane Helene, which is responsible for 115 deaths in North Carolina. Economists are mentioning this morning that the damage from this storm is projected to reach over $250 billion, making it one of the most costly storms in U.S. history. The North Carolina General Assembly will do their part within which they can this week. Legislative leaders announced on Friday that they plan to vote on potential disaster relief legislation for areas of the state coming up this week. The General Assembly was already set to be back on Wednesday to deal with the potential override of House Bill 10. However, now both the House and the Senate said that they are fastly working to develop a plan to assist Western North Carolina communities that are in desperate need of aid as a result of that historic flooding. We heard from House Speaker Tim Moore and Senate Leader Phil Berger about that. They said that they've heard from residents in towns in Western North Carolina, and they've seen the devastation firsthand. They will be back in Raleigh midweek. We'll be tracking those details here on the Carolina Journal News Hour and over at carolinajournal.com. Power outages do continue to improve this morning. There are 132,000 customers that are still without power. However, that is an increase, or rather a decrease, from what we saw when we were last together on Friday. 207,000 was the number then. Duke Energy crews and other municipal power companies still working round the clock to rebuild the electrical infrastructure to provide electricity back to some 132,000 North Carolina residents. As I mentioned, Election Day just 29 days away. What is that going to mean when early voting starts next Thursday for residents in Western North Carolina? The North Carolina State Board of Elections has a meeting today where they will be discussing what's going on in the western half of North Carolina and the impact that that will have on voting. We'll be tracking those details throughout the day as well. As criticism continues against local elected officials, FEMA, and the state government in response to Hurricane Helene and what many perceive as the slow response, Jody Barr with Queen City News sat down with the town manager from Lake Lure after a private helicopter pilot was threatened with arrest after saving multiple individuals in the town that was devastated by Hurricane Helene. It was an interesting back and forth exchange. Take a listen.
We sent messages to Assistant Chief Chris Melton, the man Jordan Sidum said ran him and any other pilot who showed up out of town under threat of arrest. But Melton never responded. Thursday morning, instead of making Assistant Chief Melton available, the town offered its town manager for an interview.
So the personal aircraft that landed was not only unauthorized, but also they provided no notification that they were coming. And that did pose a potential risk to ongoing operations with search and rescue. And then, also just wasn't safe for them to be there as regular citizens, especially since we didn't know, who they were or what they were doing there.
In the days after the storm, through that Sunday morning, there was no restricted airspace in Lake Lure. The FAA did impose a temporary flight restriction after this encounter between Mr. Sidum and the Assistant Fire Chief Melton. So you all still contend today that no one should have been in that area trying to save these people who had been stranded for 2 days headed into day 2, next to day 3?
Correct. If anything, they should have at least notified Incident Command, who would have authorized them or not authorized them to be in that area.
Sidham said he did exactly that. When he landed at the Rutherford County Airport and spoke with the people in charge, Sidham says airport officials told him they were only selling fuel to private aircraft if those pilots were helping in the search and rescue effort. Sidham has the receipts showing a fuel purchase going into Lake Lure that Sunday morning and one after the arrest threat just 2 hours later. And
I'm unaware
of that.
Yep.
Ms. Stuman, less than 24 hours later, private pilots were being asked to return to that area to do what Mr. Sidham was doing at that time. Do you see how that the public may look at that and go, well, that's a little perplexing that, just before he was severely endangering rescue efforts, and then, less than a day later, they're being begged to come back and help.
Well, I can only imagine that they went through the correct chain of command to be authorized to come here.
What was the danger posed in what Mr. Sidham did, the specific danger that day?
Well, it interrupted operations of the people who were there from national, state, and local resources, one. And two, downtown Chimney Rock is in disarray right now. For someone who's not trained, not adequately trained in emergency operations, especially at that time, they should not have been in that location.
Well, just some hours later, he was back in the area, and the county welcomed him in to do exactly what he did just the day before. Do you think his training was significantly improved overnight?
I think that it's not that we're turning away help or volunteerism at all. Once again, we just need to go through the right steps to do that. So we're aware, the state is aware, Rutherford County is aware, and the town of Lake Lure and village of Chimney Rock is aware of what's going on. That was not the case initially.
Are you all welcoming those private helicopter pilots who have delivered food and water and medical supplies and are helping rescue human lives from the mountains around Lake Lure? Are you guys welcoming them now?
That would need to go through the Rutherford County Emergency Management or the State Emergency Management.
That's Jody Barr on Queen City News. That sit down with the town manager of Lake Lure as the rescue efforts do continue out in the western half of North Carolina this morning. We've got a lot that we will be tracking coming up for you on a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. Again, the North Carolina State Board of Elections set to meet at 2 o'clock today. They will be discussing what voting is going to look like in just 29 days out west. We'll be tracking that for you. That's going to do it for a Monday edition of the News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning at 5.